This is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do medicine, and that's what was right for me.
What was your draw to medicine? What was it that kind of firmed up that resolve?
Just that idea of right livelihood, or that idea that, to be of service. You could really help people this way. And like I said, also be around people that generally cared.
Did you know those words?
I didn't know those words.
Of course
then,
not.
No. But I just
Tell
had
me more.
I just had a sense. I mean, and part of it felt like a calling because I had that sense since 6th grade that that's what I wanted to do. And I think part of it was just proving it to myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted. And but I also had a sense by that time that by the end of my first year of medical school, even though the first year was just pretty much rote memorization and not a lot of problem solving, I had a sense that the problem solving still had a place in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I could still use that when I started getting my own patients.
Right.
So I figured it was worth learning all that stuff to get to that point. Yeah, you had to have a certain database. You had to have a certain amount of information between your ears.
Right.
Or stuff you couldn't,
Certain fund of knowledge.
Right, to make sense of stuff.
So at the end of those 5 years,
Of medical school.
1982, how would you describe that young man? How would you describe who you were? Give me a picture of who you were in 1982.
Well, let's see, by that time, I was probably still pretty oblivious to my own inner processes by that time. I'd learned, obviously, quite a bit of medicine, studied hard in medical school and things. Started a family. I'd also gotten at least a clue by that time that the conventional medical model wasn't a complete model of the human being in health and illness. I already kind of knew something was amiss by that time. But I did learn a lot about the midwifery model of birthing as opposed to what we'd learned in OB, in the medical model of birthing. And so I really knew there were different things. I still didn't know anything about chiropractic or naturopathy or, I took the one nutrition class that was offered at my school, which was an elective.
Even in medical school, you knew that it was not a complete model.
Right.
And part of it was inspired by the midwifery model.
And seeing that people healed outside of conventional modalities.
Practices.
Yeah. And that the psychological aspect was important, which wasn't mentioned in medical school back then. I'm sure they do now.
Yeah, tell me about the electives.
So that was a lot of freedom. Yeah, so I think my junior years when I took, or my second, R2 second year residency, that I took that manual medicine course down in Michigan. It was a 40-hour course, and it was basic just osteopathic manipulation. So we learned how to do the rapid thrust popping and cracking of the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, the cervical spine, wrists and ankles, and just, basic things. But it's very basic. And so, but I got to where I could diagnose lesions in somebody, but I didn't have the tools to treat them. Mm-hmm. Especially the transition zones in the spine, like the transition from thoracic to cervical. There's a few segments there that the rapid thrust just doesn't work very well. So when somebody was stuck there, I didn't know where to send them, and so I went to the residency director and said, well, how do you feel about me referring clinic patients to chiropractors? And he said, he kind of sat back, and looked, and he said, well, you're responsible for your referral. So if you check them out and you think they're okay, I'll back you up on it. So I got on the phone and started calling chiropractors. And I'd get a hold of them, I'd introduce myself. I'm Dr. Hall, I'm a second-year resident over here, and I'd like to meet you for lunch and see if I can refer patients to you. But what I found, which was interesting to me, was this whole body of practitioners, and when I'd ask them about their training and their clinical experience, and they could use the terms, they knew the anatomy, they could describe clinical outcomes. I found this group of practitioners that seemed pretty well trained, and they wanted to work with doctors. They really did. They wanted to network. So that was my first real official foray out of strict conventional medicine, is when I started meeting chiropractors and talking to them, and then referring to them and seeing the patient back and seeing how it worked, and learning that, well, there's more than one kind of chiropractic. There's all these different schools of chiropractic. And then just on my own, I kept, like I said, I learned about a few other diagnoses that conventional medicine doesn't consider very often. So back then it was like candida and food reactions are the two that I remember. And so I started treating them because it was safe to treat them. I didn't really need medications, and I didn't know of any test for candida back then, but we used a questionnaire in Dr. Crook's book. And
so you read Crook?
Yeah. I thought that was pretty accurate. I mean, now anybody that doesn't feel well is going to score high on that questionnaire.
So how did you find Crook? Did a patient? Yeah, how did you find William Crook?
I think a patient.
Patient.
That's where I got most of this stuff from. Was patients bringing me in things to read or asking me questions to go look up stuff for them. Or
How about Broder Barnes?
I think I first heard of him from Dr. Singler during that week.
During the time.
Yeah, or at least somebody, maybe from the doctor in Coeur d'Alene. But that was a 2-week rotation I took with those guys. But yeah, in residency, I'd moonlit in ERs all through Michigan. They had a whole series of small towns that they wanted residents to cover them on weekends, and get paid $12 an hour or something, which is pretty good money back then, to go staff an ER for the weekend. So I got to saw a lot of trauma, acute things, all the residency stuff. I mean, so I felt pretty well prepared. I wasn't worried about going into strong.
When you finished your last year of residency, which was 1985, you were well prepared to make the transition into a kind of a more expanded view, a more expanded scope.
Felt like it, because I must have been emotionally arrested in the teenage years. You know how they say hire a teenager while they still know everything? So that's how I felt coming out of residency. Like, yeah, I could go and take on the world. And
in 1985, that's pretty early to learn that stuff. I mean, had you got an HMA meeting yet?
No, hadn't even heard of the HMA.
Okay, so go on. What happened after that?
Well, then through a series of circumstances, I ended up being the only doctor in that small town in rural Maine. And it's a town of about maybe 1,200 people, 1,500 people. So we moved to Seattle near the end of '87, November of '87 is when we moved out here. And got a job in a hospital-owned clinic in downtown. So I moved from this little tiny building on Main Street to this 40-story skyscraper. It was a big culture shock. And worked pretty conventional family practice. But we worked, back then they were doing all this stuff with managed care, right? All the PPOs and HMOs, and so we had to hire an RN just to deal with referrals, because everybody needed to be referred in their network. But I kept doing my osteopathic manipulation, and the orthopedists at the clinic, I talked with them a little bit, and they started sending me their chronic back pain patients that they wanted to get rid of anyway, because they weren't surgical candidates. And so I actually had quite a bit of experience doing manipulation there. And that was the point when Patty brought home that standard homeopathy kit. I was learning about a different kind of medicine with all the managed care and that sort of thing. But I kept learning more about homeopathy and Um, people kept bringing me stuff to read about herbs and that kind of thing, and I kind of stopped doing the hypnosis so much because it didn't work too well in that population. But I spent a lot of time counseling, it turns out, because everybody downtown was just so stressed at that point. I'm sure it's not any better now. I attended my first AHMA meeting while I was still in Maine. And I don't know how I did it, but I had met Christiane Northrup. Yeah, that AHMA meeting was really helpful, because again, I was just starting out, it seemed like, and to hear, I think that's met Paul Brenner, and met Bob Anderson too. I was pretty impressed with Bob Anderson. He's a good guy.
Yeah.
So, but that was my first exposure to AHMA, so I think I was still involved in it. The 4 years I was at Prov downtown, I went to a couple meetings and
They were
that
all
sort
in
of thing.
Seattle back then.
Yeah, so that was really handy.
That was really handy.
Yeah, I don't think I've been to one in a long, long time. But, yeah, and so we met there, and then we also met at Providence, because you were on staff, and I recognized you from the HMA meeting. That's when we started talking to each other during, morning meetings at Providence. Yeah, so what happened though was I started to learn some of these things that were a little more out there than the manipulation, like homeopathy, and I felt this need for more professional freedom. And I couldn't get it where I was practicing because it was a hospital-owned clinic and I was just an employee there. And that's when it felt right to come join Seattle Healing Arts, join you at Seattle Healing Arts. And that's when my learning really exploded, I think. Because I was able to really practice what I was learning. I also started learning the cranial work by then as an expansion of the manipulation I was doing. I learned the cranial work. And I first heard of cranial work back when I took that workshop in Michigan. But I didn't know much about it. I couldn't learn it then. Didn't feel right. So I came back to it about 7 or 8 years later. But then sitting there for an hour, really feeling these subtle rhythms and listening to what the body's trying to say, at the same time asking the patient questions about what they're feeling and how they interpret what they're feeling, that opened up a whole nother layer of learning. I mean, we're only limited by our own imagination, it turns out.
I thought you did a lot of that, didn't you?
Yeah. So that's when I discovered there are other people out there doing that. Anybody that does body work deeply enough finds out these same
Stuff
ideas.
spills out.
Yeah. I mean, every massage therapist you talk to has had somebody break down and cry while they were getting a massage, if they've been massaging people long enough.
Yeah.
What's that about? And to be able to have the tools to help that person once that therapeutic window is open, that'd be cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why we need to bring these concepts into conventional medicine, so more and more practitioners have a wider variety of tools to offer people when those moments arise, But to even go fishing for those moments is possible though too. So, but I learned all that just from doing the cranial work. I wasn't trained that way really. It's just, again, listening to patients and always looking for, okay, what is a better question? How can we help? I personally think we need a medicine that can deal with all this stuff, because it all has an effect on our health.
Right.
Right? Think of something in your life that has no impact on your health. Right.
Zero.
Yeah. So to really have a medical model that fits, we need a medicine that can take anything in your experience into account.
Right.
So that's what I've been searching for, basically, in all these years. And so I think all the pieces exist. It's just a matter of putting them together.